Welcome to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC grant on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Anne Rasmussen of King's College London and the University of Copenhagen. Anne is a professor of political science, and she's also the PI of the ERC project, Advocacy in Digital Democracy. Today, she'll be presenting an article that is currently in press at the American Political Science Review about the costs of running and engaging in politics. So to make the most of our time, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Anne will speak until the top of the hour. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who've prepared questions in advance about the article. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Anne's response. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions in the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts for the panelists' review. Thank you for joining us. And Anne, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for having me. I think this is a great initiative. I mean, not only do you yourself have a really interesting and important ESC project, but I also think you're doing a fantastic job with the speaker series, which I actually think is sort of unheard of. At least I don't know about like this format. So I think you're innovating a lot by setting this up and bringing a lot of people together. And I also very much appreciate, first and foremost, the opportunity to interact with your students after my presentation. As Jenny said, I've got the pleasure of presenting an article that is forthcoming in the APSR. We had actually hoped it would be online now, but it's very, very soon to being online, meaning that the media coverage, or at least some of the media coverage, came before the actual article. But it's going to be very soon out there, and I'm, of course, happy to share with anyone who wants to see it. It's an article about the cost of engaging in politics and the potential differential costs of engaging in politics for men and women. And as you can see here on the front page of my presentation, it's an article that I've written together with one of my brilliant colleagues in Copenhagen, Greg Eady. And what I'm going to do in the presentation is basically to first set the scene a little bit, tell you what we already know about the potential differential costs of engaging in politics for men and women. Then I'm also, of course, going to tell you what I think we still need to know and explain how I think we contribute, present our findings, and finally discuss those findings together with you, I hope. I could share my slides, but I can actually not move forward. Here we go. So why is it interesting to focus on the role of gender when it comes to the costs of running for politics or engaging in politics? I mean, it's quite interesting, and it's also quite relevant because we have substantive anecdotal evidence that female politicians are likely to face and be burdened by the kind of toxic behavior they encounter on social media. Some of that is anecdotal. A very famous example from earlier this year was actually set by the Danish Prime Minister, who posted a number of examples of the quite toxic messages he's been receiving. But there are also a number of other anecdotes, and these are not just anecdotes about what is happening, but these are also anecdotes about how it actually affects the politicians in question. So another prominent example would be the former Dutch finance minister, Sigrid Kaag, who explicitly mentioned the kind of toxicity and harassment she had experienced as a reason for leaving Dutch politics altogether. It's not just anecdotal evidence, though. We also know from surveys of parliamentarians themselves that a majority of the female ones actually report experiencing this kind of toxic behavior. And we also have some suggestive, though primarily observational evidence that female politicians, especially the high-profile ones, might encounter more of this type of behavior than their male colleagues are doing. So this is just an example of why it might matter. It's another anecdote, but it's from a Canadian politician who was running recently, and she came out afterwards, talked about her experiences, and basically made very clear that if she would have known about the abuse that she would have faced, she would never have run. And she also kind of said, based on this experience, that she would never ever subject herself to this again. So I'm just presenting these examples to outline the relevance of things. I'm also presenting them because it's not just about whether those high-profile women we've got active in politics at the current point of time are going to stay, but this is also something that potentially has wider consequences for all the people potentially considering entering politics. So there's a younger generation, which is important because we know that in most countries around the world, we still don't have gender parity in politics altogether. So it's something that we should be concerned about. Where do we then come in compared to the existing scholarship that we've got? Well, a lot of the research that looks at toxicity is very focused on the contents of what is sort of being said and how often it is being said. And some of that work is automated, but we are kind of saying here that that's very worthwhile. It's very important work. But if we want to understand this phenomena, we really have to look beyond just the contents of what is happening and the frequency with which it is being happened. And we need to look a bit more at the perceptions of what is happening. And that's what we mean by sort of saying in the third point on my slides that we think there is a potential double burden that women might actually be facing when engaging in politics. The first burden would have something to do with the fact that they potentially, the verdict is still out here, but that they potentially might actually receive more toxic behavior than their male counterparts. But the second potential burden, which is really what we are looking at here, is that irrespective of whether they would receive the same amount of messages and messages that have exactly the same content, we think that there are potential indirect costs of receiving that kind of behavior that are actually harder and tougher to deal with for women than for men. And that's what we're tapping into by actually looking at the perceptions of these messages and how they vary subject to whether they're sent to a man or sent to a woman. And to sort of get that argument, because it's a little bit tricky maybe to get it at first sight, you can think of this as an argument that is similar to how we think about legal regimes and workplaces. So it's not just about whether any given crime, for example, has happened, but when deciding how to sentence a crime, we often think about actually what the intent was of the person that committed the crime, and we perceive it as more serious if we actually think any given crime is driven by motives that we dislike. Similar to when something happens in the workplace, if someone doesn't get a promotion, we're likely to think that that's more problematic if the reason for not getting the promotion was, for example, motivated, by implicit reasons that the person's ethnicity was actually something that people were not too pleased about, and this is the reason that someone wasn't actually allowed to accelerate on the career ladder. So that's to give you an example. So we want to focus on how these forms of toxic behavior are perceived, because we think that how they're perceived and the intentions behind them are actually likely to say something about what the cost of receiving them ultimately are. So that's our argument in a nutshell. That means that to really understand what we then refer to as the downstream cost or the second burden of this kind of behavior, we want to focus on perceptions. And we focus on perceptions here of those that are ultimately the targets of this kind of behavior that we are examining, namely the politicians themselves, but also those that are, bystanders or witnessing this kind of behavior, but also those that potentially might, consider engaging in politics, namely, broader sets of citizens. And we look at perceptions of both these two types of groups. Then we, of course, think that there are many attributes of a conversation or the context of a conversation that could affect these things. So the key thing for us is the gender of the politician being attacked. But you will see in what I'm going to present to you that we also look at a number of other things, such as the gender of the person who criticizes the politician, whether there's a shared identity between the person that we, ask for an assessment of the conversation and the politician that is being attacked, etc. So that's to set the scene. What does all of this enable us to do? I mean, we think it enables us to say something about the causal effect that contextual characteristics have on assessments of toxic behavior directed towards politicians. What we also think is that we go a bit beyond that, because we're actually also able with this research to say something about the mechanisms that are driving this kind of behavior. So this is an academic politician, so I guess I shouldn't fully reveal what we find, but I can tell you that we actually do find that toxic behavior addressed to women is seen as more severe than when it is addressed to men. But what is so important about our research is that we go beyond that. We also get into why that is the case. So we have a second study, which I'll present to you, that looks at whether the motives seen as driving different types of toxic behavior are actually seen as different, subject to whether it is a female or a male politician that is being attacked. So this is a simple diagram of the expected effects and moderators in our study. A lot of theory will be relatively, I think, familiar to a lot of you, but the key thing we want to examine, so H1, is simply whether there's a difference in the perception of the severity of any given toxic behavior, subject to whether the target of it is a man or a woman. But then we also look into whether that effect is conditioned by a number of other factors. So key factors we want to focus on is whether the effect is stronger if not only is a woman being criticized, but the explicit gender of the politician in question is also being mentioned. So that's what we mean by gendered methods in hypothesis 3. We also want to know whether the effect of a woman being attacked is stronger when that attack comes from a man as opposed to a woman. And then we want to know whether certain characteristics of those that are perceiving the conversation, so in a way the respondents that we've got in our experiments, whether that also affects whether there is a difference in the extent to which an attack on a woman is seen as worse than an attack on a man. And we focus here on a number of characteristics, such as the gender of the politician, also the ideology of the politician, whether the respondent is a co-partisan of the politician being attacked, and also whether there's personal exposure or the extent to which the respondent that we've got in our study has had personal exposure to hostility. For some of the hypotheses, we have one directional expectations. You will also see for some of them that we're actually saying that the relationship could go both ways. So I'm not going to systematically go through all of them, but what we, for example, mean when it comes to the difference in personal exposure to hostility, on the one hand, we might think that those that have experienced hostility themselves might be particularly, cautious and know about, all the possible negative consequences of it. So in a way, might be more sensitive to seeing attacks on a woman versus a man. But we could also actually expect the opposite to have happened, that this kind of behavior has become more normalized in their world, meaning that they might actually also be less sensitive to a woman being attacked compared to a man being attacked. So that's to give you a brief sort of outline of the expectations that we'll be able to examine with the hypothesis that we've set up. And this is simply like the hypothesis in words, but I already talked about them. The key one to focus on is that we think that messages to female politicians should be perceived as more toxic than to male politicians. And the reason we think this is the case is that we systematically think that the motives inferred, as underlying any given attack should be systematically different when it's a female as opposed to a male politician. And we dig into that in the second experiment. So we think it's, when it is a female politician, the reason we should think that it is worse is that we think that our respondents will be more likely to believe that any given attack, so it can be exactly the same thing that is said to a man and a woman, but we think it is perceived as more likely to be driven by prejudice or an attempt to kick the person out of politics if it is said to a woman, as opposed to when it is being said to a man. And then we've got the other expectations that I already talked to you about. How are we then going to examine it? I already revealed that we've got not just one, but 2 survey experiments. In the first survey experiments, we basically present our respondents with 2 conversations on social media that are so-called visual conjoined experiments. So that means that they're set up so that they look like real conversations on social media where a politician is being attacked by citizens. We run these experiments in 4 countries. They're not chosen because we think that there are certain institutional features that would lead us to expect differences between them. They're in a way more chosen because we'd like to see whether these relationships are actually robust across quite different national contexts. And as I said, we think it's relevant to do this both with samples of politicians and citizens. So that's what we've got in all the different countries. This is what the first experiment looks like. So this is the conversations that visually mimics, like real social media conversations. You basically see 2 examples of conversations where we've got, in both cases, a politician that is being attacked by a citizen. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we actually, constructed these treatments in practice. But that's what it would look like to a respondent. And a respondent will simply be asked to read the 2 conversations and has to answer to us which of the two ones that the respondent sees as most disrespectful of the two. So we're not using the word toxic. We don't want you know, to sort of put words in their mouth. So we ask in more neutral terms which of the two is seen as most disrespectful. What do we then vary and how are these conversations constructed? I mean, we basically have millions of images that we end up sort of using in our experiment, but we basically, first of all, vary the gender of the politician. That is key. And we've got 18 images of politician, half of which are women, half of which are men, with names that are culturally specific to the 4 countries in question. We then also vary the partisanship of the politician, which you could see here. So we ended up in the example of having someone from the Democratic and Republican Party. It's an example from the US. And we basically have representatives of parties representing the major parties in the blocks of our country in question, which would range from 2 to 4, depending on which country we're looking at. Then we vary the gender of the user. So this is the citizen that is attacking the politician. Again, with 18 images, half of which are men and women, and again, with names that are culturally specific to each country. And then we, of course, also vary the text. It is very important to say here that all the issues are selected in such a way that they're variance issues as opposed to positional issues, and they cover different issue areas. So this is an example of some of the text that we used in these different issue areas. So for example, for economy, a politician might say, we need to remove barriers that limit opportunities for those seeking jobs in government. The bill we're introducing today will ensure that skills and experience counts as much as formal education. So it's a relatively sort of neutral statement that most people would probably agree with that is being presented, and which a citizen in this case then responds to. And it's very important to say here that the citizen responds in a toxic way. We've got 16 texts. I would like to tell you that we just made up something nasty, but these texts are inspired by actual tweets sent by citizens to politicians. And what is also very important to say here is that we know that the severity of toxicity, of course, would affect these things. And that's not the key that we want to examine here. So this is really constructed in such a way that the tone and the level of toxicity is quite similar across these different messages. And we, in a way, want to hold that constant, because that is not the addition that we're making here. We've got versions of these toxic texts that are then gendered. So that would be that they do not just criticize a politician, but they will mention the gender of the politician, be it a man or a woman. And as I told you, altogether, that leads to a very, very high number of different images that then vary in the first conjoined experiment. So this is an example of some of the messages that are, are not entirely made up, but inspired by real messages. So here you've got an example. Let me read the first one. A citizen might say to a politician after having heard a statement, such as the one I just read to you about the economy. The citizen might say, the simple truth is that 99% of what? This politician, this woman, or this man, and that will then depend on whether we want to mention the gender of the politician, and if we do, whether the politician is a man or a woman, is utterly stupid. Imagine being that dumb, can't wait for this person, her, him, to be voted out. So that's in a nutshell what the first experiments look like. As I said, responding to which of the two is most disrespectful. The second experiment then looks very similar to what you have already seen. The difference is just that there is only going to be one conversation. So a citizen or a politician, depending on who is the respondent, is basically looking at one conversation. And the key here is not only to score actually the level of toxicity of the conversation, they do that as well, but the key here is actually to ask the respondents what they actually think was the motive of the very critical citizen that said something not too pleasant to the politician in question. That's basically the setup. What I'll then do is that I'll walk you through the findings, and then I'll discuss the conclusions a little bit. I think I've got about 10 minutes, so I think I'm more or less on time. Jenny looks pretty happy. I may have spoken a little bit fast. I hope it's still relatively clear. What do we find? Is it the case that attacks on a woman, even if they're more or less equivalent to an attack on a man, are perceived as more severe? And that is definitely the case. That is what we see up here in the plot. So you basically got the examples for the politician sample, and you've got the example for the citizen sample, and they're broken down by country. And the sort of top effects that you see up here are basically for this main effect. And you can see, and it's quite robust between the countries, you can see that equivalent messages sent to men and women are not understood in the same way, sort of underlining one of the key points I made in the beginning, that if we want to understand this, which we think has something to say about the indirect costs of engaging in politics, we need to look at us a bit more than at question wording and how often things occur. What I'm then presenting below are actually not some of the key things that we were hypothesizing about. These are just the main effects, but we can see that if a text is gendered, but it can both be gendered, in the case of making an attack on a man or a woman, then it is also seen as more toxic. And there seems to be no effect on the gender of the user and whether the respondent is a co-partisan of the politician in question. That's not what our key focus was. What we wanted to know with these additional characteristics, so I'll get back to them. What we wanted to know with these ones was whether they were conditioning the first effect. So whether being a co-partisan of the politician in question would actually affect the effect that we saw of attacks on a woman being seen as more severe compared to attacks on a man. So I'll get back to them, but this is just for transparency, showing you all the main effects here. Is the effect, so the main effect that we showed you in the top, is this then larger when the message isn't just toxic, but also mentions the politician's gender, and when the attack that is being made is from a man, and we see that is the case. That is what these interaction plots are showing. So it is even worse to say something negative to a woman if when doing so you also mention the woman's gender, or if that attack on a woman is coming from a man as opposed to a female user that they're interacting with on social media. Are there then differences according to the characteristics of the respondents? And I told you that for some of the characteristics, I mentioned the examples of existing experiences with harassment. So that's what you would see in the bottom of this figure. I said we can imagine relationships to go both ways, but there were probably other features of respondents where we actually had more one-directional effects, maybe, for example, with respect to gender. There we actually had the expectation that, when it is a female respondent that is looking at this, she will all things equal actually think, she will, the effect of thinking that it's worse when a woman is being attacked compared to when a man is being attacked is stronger for a female as opposed to a male respondent. And we see something going in that direction with the effects, but what is perhaps most striking in our study is actually that these overall effects that I've been talking about, they actually hold across different subsets of citizens. We also, for example, see that for ideology, we actually don't find significant differences between those with left and right-wing ideology. Similar again for co-partisanship and experiences with harassment. So I want to sort of underline that what we have found is actually quite significant, because even if there are sort of smaller differences, I mean, our samples are not that small that we couldn't potentially detect significant effects. We actually find that these overall findings hold across these subsets of citizens. And I also showed you before, across these quite different subsets of respondents, politicians and citizens, and also across these quite different country contexts. What about, why is this then happening? Which is, as I said, also sort of a key addition. And I also mentioned to you that we have the expectation that we would, we would see this difference in how any given attack is perceived on a man and a woman. And we think that the reason should be that the motives ascribed to the attack are different. And that's what we test with a single invert. Here's just one example of what it could have looked like. The respondent then afterwards get asked which of a set of motives they actually thought were underlying the toxic behavior they saw as citizen sort of presenting to a politician. So we asked them whether they actually thought this was motivated by prejudice. We asked them whether they thought it was, motivated by attempt to discourage a politician from being in politics. We asked if they thought that the, attack was simply a question of opinion differences with the politician, dislike of the politician's party, dissatisfaction with the respondent's own life, to be honest, and therefore just saying something nasty, or maybe just motivated, by an attempt to get a reaction from the politician in question, or maybe a reaction from other users. And these options, of course, were randomized. I mean, now you see them ranked in a nice order, but they were randomized in the experiment, and you basically see now the results from the politician and the citizen sample. And what we basically want to know is whether the extent to which these motives were seen as being in place were now varying, subject to whether it was a female or a male politician that they saw being attacked, which we find, strong indications is the case. We can see that if it is a female politician that is being attacked compared to a male politician, then our respondents, and this holds across both the politician and citizen sample, are much more likely to think that it was driven by prejudice and an attempt to discourage the politician from being in politics. On the other hand, and that's interesting, they think it is significantly less likely to be merely seen as driven by opinion differences between the user in question and the politician. This effect is only significant in the politician sample, as you can see, but it's negative actually in both cases. Whereas the other potential motives, they don't seem to vary, or the extent to which, our respondents think that they are at play doesn't seem to vary depending on the gender of the politician that is being attacked. We can then also see, and this is the last result, then I will discuss our findings. We can then also see that not only is prejudice more likely to be seen as a motivation for a toxic attack when the politician in question that is being attacked is a woman, but it becomes also even more likely when the attack, is made in the form of a gender text, so mentioning the name of the gender of the politician, and when the attack comes from a man. So then these, the extent to which these motives are seen as being in place are even stronger. What does all of this mean? Let me summarize and discuss a bit. And I also look forward then to your questions in the discussion. But what we think we have found here is quite strong evidence that perceptions of toxicity are actually contextually conditioned, which means that equivalent messages sent to women are simply judged as more toxic. These effects are, as I also showed, stronger when the message is gendered and the harasser is male. And it's quite striking that they hold across a number of relevant subgroups of the respondents that we're looking at. We also think it's quite striking that the reason, seems to be that the perceived motivations behind these toxic attacks systematically vary depending on whether the object of attack is a male or a female politician. So toxicity towards female politicians is connected with intentions to discriminate against them in politics, to say bluntly, and less likely to be seen as simply driven by opinion differences between the critical citizens engaging with them and the politician in question. So conclusion and implications, I gave you a summary of what I had already said. Well, we think this potentially means that there is a double burden for women of engaging in politics, right? It's not just about whether they receive toxicity and how often it happens, right? But because these motivations are perceived as different, and because people ultimately react, based on what they actually think the motivations of those that attack them were, there is this, potential double burden for women of engaging in politics altogether. We also think that our study, given the robustness of the findings, underline the need to understand how the context, affects perceptions of toxic behavior, which is very relevant for those, working with algorithms, trying, to think about content moderation and scoring level of toxicity in any given message. That might be, going a long way towards addressing the phenomenon, but it might not actually get us all the way, because we can basically see that who is talking to each other, for example, also has a very big impact and on how these things are perceived, and therefore also indirectly the potential consequences that they're likely to draw from them. Which, and that's a very sort of broad statement, but I think we all need to remember that, but that probably at the end of the day means that improving democratic dialogue isn't just about changing what people say, but about, teaching them to be sensitive to what is deemed respectful within any given context. And with that, I will finish, actually on time.
Thanks so much, Anne. Wow. such an anchor for shifting now to the Q&A. I'll introduce our course panelists who will lead the Q&A with me, and I'll add, we had the special honor of already being able to take a look at the paper and read it carefully in its proofs form. We know our participants haven't yet seen it. You'll keep your eyes open for when it's published in APSR. So our panelists will ask their questions one after the next, and then we'll give time for Anne to respond to these questions. And a reminder to participants, you're all welcome to send to us during this time any questions in the chat that you'd like us to consider for the second round of Q&A. So the first question from our panelist is from Yemi, who is a PhD student in our Health Policy and Management program. Yemi.
Thank you very much, Anne, for such an excellent and clear presentation. My question is this: in light of the findings from your research, do you see possible opportunities for policy change? For example, do you have in mind how the findings can be disseminated to advance next steps? For example, the possibility of creating regulations against political toxicity online in general, or maybe particularly towards women?
Thanks, Yemi. Next, we have a question from Paul Fish, who's a community auditor of the course. Paul.
Okay. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. My question is, according to reporting from your article or from your work, evidence has shown that women preemptively adopt male-dominant behavior patterns to avoid gender-based judgment. This quote made me wonder if you think that your findings are likely to be specific to the professional engagements of women in politics, or whether you think your findings might be relevant for other elite and public professional fields as well, such as in business, and in general, people who think they belong to a certain minority.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And next is Ashana Ashaba, who is an MA student in our African Sustainable Communities program. Ashana. Let's see if we can see her here. I know Ashana was having some connectivity challenges earlier, so I'll go ahead and ask her question. It'll be a bit strange that I'm asking it and not Ashana, because it really is about her background, but it's a really important question that we all had in reading the article. So Ashana she was born in Uganda, and she now lives in Kenya. And reading the paper for her made her wonder how the findings of this study may differ if researchers conducted it in a less democratic or a non-democratic context. So in these contexts, public speech by citizens that some may consider to be disrespectful, and that was the term, as you noted, Anne, that you all used in the paper for how to measure toxicity, may actually really be justified as proactive speech by citizens who are fighting to maintain basic rights. So we're curious if you have any thoughts on that specific question, and if you were to field the study again in other countries, where else might you field it? And that wraps up our first round of Q&A. And now we'll have some time to hear Anne's responses. And I'll also drop the questions that we just asked in the chat for everyone to be able to see. Thanks.
Absolutely, thanks. And thanks a lot for the questions. They're really good questions, actually. I think I'll answer them actually in the order that they were posed. The first question is the million-dollar question, and I revealed early on that there was already a bit of media coverage of the paper. So, I mean, so the first question is what to do now? Like, what are the implications of this? What should we decide? How can we sort of prevent this? This is how I would interpret the first question, right? And that's, of course, what all the journalists wanted to know. Some of them ended up concluding, or maybe we should ask the politicians about that. But I think, I mean, I'm not going to say what countries should do, but I think, as I touched upon a little bit towards the end of the presentation, I think it does mean that considering consent moderation, I mean, it can definitely be worthwhile. But if consent moderation is just based on the text itself, that might not be sufficient. So we need maybe to think of consent moderation and the way that algorithms work for singling out potentially toxic behavior. They would have to to be sophisticated enough to take some of these contextual factors into account. And that maybe leads actually very well to the second question that Paul asked me, if I may, because you were asking me a little bit whether we actually think that this generalizes beyond gender. Like, can we actually think of this dynamic actually working in other spheres, such as when toxic behavior is addressed, say, towards ethnic minorities or some other kind of sensitive groups in society? And we actually think it might, because the kind of theory we propose here is not a gender-specific theory, right? We are kind of saying that the way this is actually, is going to be perceived depends on the kind of motives that we think it is driven by. So we can very well imagine that if we would sort of be dealing with ethnic minorities instead, saying the same thing to them as was said to, people that were less in an ethnic minority situation, would actually be seen as being driven by quite different motives. And in that case, we actually think that the dynamics should be more or less exactly the same. So we think it applies more broadly, which also means that, when taking policy implications, I'm not just saying now that any content moderation would have to consider gender, right? It would probably have to consider a number of relevant identities of those that are engaged in social media conversations more generally. And finally, to Asuna's questions, I think that is a very good point. When, as I said, so we didn't just make up these toxic messages, but we did indeed look at, the kind of messages that are posed to politicians in the kind of context that we examine. So if I were to implement this study in other contexts, you definitely have to consider like how people speak to each other there to actually, single out toxic behavior that was relevant in any given context. Having said that, I think the general mechanism that we're pointing out here, would actually be the same. So I would, in a way, tailor the treatment to any given context, but I think the theoretical mechanism that we are proposing would actually be one that I actually think could apply also, across less privileged, sets of country contexts.
Okay, thanks for those really interesting answers, Anne, and also to the panelists for the questions. And now we'll share a few questions that came in from the chat. And the first question that I'll ask, and then I'll pass it to Yemi, is Francisca Castro. Oh, I see she now is able to be live. Francisca is one of the research team members of the project, and she'll ask the question herself. Go for it, Francisca.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, very interesting paper. I didn't have the time to read it in advance, though, so maybe the questions that I have are already addressed in the paper, so I apologize in advance. But I'm very curious about whether you find different results depending on the age of the respondent. I'm specifically thinking about the case of Chile, because I'm from Chile, and usually you have like a very differential treatment of women depending on the age cohort, right? Older cohorts are more conservative and have this all like kind of like Marianistic view of gender, like women has to be respected, like mothers, etc. And younger generations, not so much. So I'm wondering if you disaggregated the results by the age of the respondent, and you see anything related to that. My other question was, as I remember when you showed the different experimental vignettes and how you manipulated the gender and the gender of the politician and also the gender of the user who responded. I'm wondering whether you also included this anonymous users, right? The people who are you cannot really identify if they're a man or a woman on Twitter, maybe anonymous users or users who have like names that are not necessarily real names, right? And maybe how that could also relate to the fact that if you are kind of protected by an anonymous identity, maybe people perceive you more as a hostile user or a hostile person. And the other question that I have, I'm sorry, I I thought it was going to be only one, but I just want to take the chance.
Good. So don't worry. Please ask.
I know that there are some countries that have very strict laws about online harassment, and even they can even go to your house if you posted something offensive against someone. And I remember that in Chile we had a case not so long ago, maybe like two years ago or something, that someone tweeted a dream that they had, like they dreamt that they assassinated a politician, a female politician who was a state minister back then in the previous government. And it was on the news because they sent the police to his house basically to arrest him because he tweeted that he dreamt about this event. And at the end, everyone was like, this is absurd, like how you're tweeting about like a dream that you had, and then this government send you the police to your house. So I'm wondering how people perceive also like the extremes, right? Like the overreaction of this like violence against women, especially when they have positions of power, and especially when they are in ideological positions that are contrary to the respondents' own views. In this case, I remember that it was very controversial because it was this like right-wing government that didn't had a good track with police and with repression. So sending police over to someone's house was very like seen as an overstep of the government functions. So, but yeah, those were my questions. Very interesting project.
Oh, they're great. I cannot answer sort of all of them. Maybe the second one first, actually, about how would it actually have looked like if there was a gender neutral user. I think it would be very interesting to look at that. I have to say we haven't done that. I mean, I guess also sort of for reasons of power, it's better not to vary too many things, but I can definitely see an interesting study there. Also, given the so we do some other work, which is sort of more descriptive. We work with social media data, and for some of that, it has been relevant to classify accounts, and there is a substantial number of accounts that can actually not be classified. So we do know that. Let's see what happens though to the whole social media landscape and with Twitter, or X. But we do know that there are a lot of accounts actually that you cannot identify, and they are in a way also part of the debate. So I definitely think it would be worthwhile to look into how that is perceived. I just have to say that it wasn't within the scope of what we were doing, but I think it sounds really, really relevant. For AIDS, this wasn't a primary thing we tested here. I mean, of course, the treatments are randomly assigned between the citizens, and the samples of the citizens are representative of the population. So we are actually not specifically into the effect. We do have a more descriptive paper based on this of this study as well, where we're basically descriptively looking at people's perceptions of their own experiences on and offline. And there we actually look at sort of potential inequalities in exposure. So there are different kinds of sort of negative exposure that they can have experienced on and offline. And so we disaggregate that. We want to know actually whether inequalities, and by inequalities, we think of inequalities not just across gender, but also age groups, as you mentioned, extremity in ideology as another example. And in that paper, we do actually see that especially younger people are really exposed to this kind of toxic behavior according to themselves, and they actually report higher exposure. And that exposure, as far as I can recall the findings now, is even exacerbated in an online compared to an offline context. So I definitely think that there's something to look into with respect to AIDS that you're talking about. We think that paper is kind of interesting, even if it is descriptive, because it makes this comparison between off and online, and wanting to actually know whether those potential differences we see in exposure are mainly sort of online, are mainly replicating what we see offline, or exacerbating them, or maybe in other cases mitigating them. So we think that's kind of neat about that one. About the last Chilean example, I don't know sort of enough about it. It sounds like something to look closer into. We do sometimes see some slight differences in the findings between countries, and there are a couple of instances where Chile sticks out, even if what I presented to you, it's largely robust across countries, but there are some smaller differences, and I don't know, for example, whether the case in question is actually a potential source here that could contribute to explaining some of that.
Okay, thanks, Anne. We have questions ready for round 2, those we brainstormed and others that came in the chat. I want to pause before going to those and see if we have here joining us as a participant, Beth Leach, who's one of the leading political scientists on interest groups and lobbying. And I'm curious if you have anything that you'd like to add in based on your experience. You're welcome to if you'd like. You see Beth looking.
There's some interesting research by Alexandra Felindra at University of Illinois, Chicago, who's been looking at this as well, mostly talking to politicians about their experiences with this, and particularly women politicians and their experiences with this. So this was a fascinating paper, and I'm just enjoying hearing more and more about it.
All right, great. Thanks, Beth. So we're going to do a second round of questions now, again, doing them one after another from our panelists. And we'll start here with Yemi. Go for it.
So my question is, do people's views on gender-related toxicity change as society becomes more aware of gender discrimination? Meaning, do you think that increasing awareness of political toxicities towards women may be a way to mitigate political toxicity and its impact?
Okay. Thanks. Let's come to we'll do 2 more questions, then we'll hear Anne's response. We talked in the class about how we know, this study itself is a cross-sectional survey at one point in time, but we're really curious to hear your instincts and thoughts on that. Next question from Paul.
Thank you for your answers. And the second question to you is, I'm always looking for a certain kind of solution to a problem. And the way you have described is a problem, the toxicity. So have you recognized that the toxicity to women or to others could be working as a boomerang to the person who behaved in a toxic way? I mean, this is maybe would be an educated way to change the attitude to others.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I mean?
And our next
I think I have something to say, then you can tell me if I answer. Yeah.
That's a good way to go. And I think our next question from Ashana relates to Paul's question, but from a different angle.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I went off, my internet got disconnected. I'm glad that your paper, you kept mentioning how everything is contextually conditioned, because I find this whole topic of toxicity, in my context, it borders, there's a thin line between toxicity and suppression of freedom of expression. So my question is about, I expected to see some of the women politicians and even the citizens in the survey who are also perpetrators of that toxicity that you define. Because in most cases, political opponents tend to use unflattering language when describing or referring to each other, especially if one has an opposing view. So that's something I did not see, and I would like a comment on that.
Okay.
I actually think, so let me take that first. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's an interesting thought, actually. In a way, I think in a sort of follow-up study, we shouldn't just, I told you we've got this more descriptive paper asking the politicians and the citizens about their experiences with all of this, but I mean, we could also have asked them how they judge their own behavior. I'm not sure like how honest they would have been though, right? But it is definitely true that it's not just citizens that say something. I mean, the debate climate among politicians themselves can definitely be very toxic, and it's definitely also something that one would need to look into. We do some more general experiments about democratic deliberation, and I think this might touch upon some of what Paul is addressing, because he was a little bit like what to do like with those like toxic people, and I was asked a policy question, and then I talked a bit about content moderation, etc. So we can of course single them out, and we can delete what they write, but another way of course would be if there's some way to sort of educate or stimulate or incentivize people to talk to each other in a nicer way. So we actually run some experiments they're done with citizens, where citizens get to debate, in this case with a chatbot, ChatGPT, to actually see whether we can improve the quality of democratic dialogue subject to how we actually talk to them. So is there a way, and we don't just want to know actually if we can get them to talk in a nicer way. We're also interested ultimately, of course, if one can affect their attitudes and their views of other people. Preliminary findings show that that we cannot affect like the attitudes themselves to give, on the policy topic they're debating, but we can definitely affect the way they view the people they're interacting with, and we can definitely also affect the way that they talk to each other, and the effects there are actually quite substantial. So that could be sort of another policy implication, that, and I know, I was actually presenting this work, we had a session here at King's, on democratic deliberation with organized together with the Cabinet Office here in the UK, and there are actually people from the UK government's policy lab, and I know that these are actually the kind of things that they work with in practice, and there might actually be some potential for us collaborating, fingers crossed, with them in doing some of these more practical things in practice. But we have so far done this with citizens. There is the idea to potentially try something along those lines with politicians as well in the longer run, in the projects that I have the pleasure of working on. I think I might more, whether the first question on awareness rising, I may not have answered. So with that, it speaks a little bit again to solutions. So does making people aware of this, help in itself? I think it potentially does, right? So I think also the reason that the study gained a fair degree of traction, for example, in the Danish media, is that people seem to think this is a good and a relevant story to tell, also because there are enough cases of people drawing consequences when being exposed to these kind of things. So I definitely think awareness rising is part of the treatment, or yeah.
I'll add in that the way in the paper that you all describe it as a double burden, the fact that the prejudice against the political toxicity toward women is perceived as even more harsh, so that it's counterintuitive, right? In some ways, one would think, oh, then the public would be sympathetic to that person and then maybe support them more. But you're sort of showing that it sort of is a doubling down effect of the pain of the experience and the political implications.
I am, but it's more. More double burden in terms of that we think that the politicians themselves, or that the potential politicians are likely to draw consequences from seeing this. It's not that it's not necessarily that citizens view the victims of the attacks more negatively, right? But it is that they view the acts as more negative, and that can have real implications actually for the future of politics.
Yep, for sure. I see that we have a hand up from Ashana. Go for it.
Thank you so much. So I find it interesting when we talk about politicians, because now I don't know if it's those who are already in positions of power or those who are contesting. So that's maybe some clarity I would need on that. But secondly, when we talk about the actions, the toxicity from the citizens or politicians themselves or whatever, in my context specifically, like what made me get interested in analyzing this paper was something that happened like 2 weeks ago. Someone called out the director of public prosecutions. He used very unflattering language, and then there are people who are saying he should be arrested and jailed. And I asked the question, if you want him to be jailed, aren't you like the president, the military dictator we have, who jails people on TikTok, who tell him that his son is incompetent because this woman is incompetent, and this person called her incompetent but using unflattering words? And then there was this whole exchange of, oh, that's what he said is misogynistic, but we've had women say similar things about...
We want to give a few moments at the end for Anne to wrap up. So if you have a specific question here in the Q&A, go for it.
Oh, yes. I've lost my train of thought, but let me get back to the specific question. So some of these I wanted maybe to look at some of these actions, the toxicity, isn't it also motivated by the actions of the politicians themselves? Like maybe some of the policies they support or some of the comments they make, isn't that what also brings the toxicity? Have you looked at it that way as well? I don't know if the question is clear because I lost my train of thought, but
yeah. I mean, I think I see what you're saying. I mean, you're not kind of saying it's justified that these citizens are saying something toxic, but you're kind of saying that the politicians themselves sometimes don't start out, in the nicest way. And I mean, we can definitely find examples of that also on social media. It's not the setting that we're focused on. Our politicians are all actually speaking in quite a civil way, and they're talking about an issue that isn't a positional one, so it shouldn't be sort of too divisive. Like everyone should sort of support more education or support improving the economy. That's why we had the variance issues. But I can see what you mean, and I think, I mean, I never think it's justified to say something nasty to another person. You respected what the person said to you, and it doesn't matter whether it's a citizen or a politician, right? But there could be a study, which would also consider, behavior of politicians that we wouldn't rank as being very respectful to begin with. Unfortunately, it's just not what we had the sort of resources to do here in our first attempt.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we wanted to ask a wrap-up question that spoke to both the motivation of the study and what you might see for the future. So we were curious if this study was motivated, you and your co-author, from observing it in the real world and then deciding to study it as a political phenomenon, or if it's something that kind of came more out of your broad research agenda and you saw an opportunity to study it there, or maybe it's a bit of both. And if you want to say anything about next step research that you see coming out of it, you already mentioned a bit, but if there's anything else you'd like to tell us, we're curious to hear.
So I guess it is actually a bit of both. So Greg and I have a project together which, broadly speaking, studies inequality and democratic representation with a focus on the sort of democratic exchanges that are happening on social media, not least due to Greg's very impressive technical skills in this area. So I guess it makes sense then to consider sort of key, dividing lines along which we could think of potential inequality, and gender is definitely one of them. Then I guess it's also partially inspired by stories and things we had read about, even if I have to say the study in some respects also became quite topical along the way, because some of those anecdotes I told you about, with the Dutch finance minister resigning or the Danish prime minister posting examples, I mean, these all happened when we had conducted the study. So it also sort of served to reinforce that this was worth looking into. We do other stuff in relation to gender. We might also actually do something with ethnicity, but it's still on the drawing board. What we have been working intensely on is another study on democratic dialogue that I mentioned to you as well. Then we've got also more descriptive work coming out of these things. So there's quite a lot on the drawing board, but potentially it's also quite valuable and important research. We hope with this study, I mean, in a way it's testing quite a basic question and showing, things that, at the outset, might not seem very surprising, but actually, showing that the same text is perceived so differently subject to the gender, I mean, does sort of highlight an understanding of this phenomenon that we think goes beyond how it's been understood so far.
Amazing. Thanks, Anne. Well, we'll be watching carefully to learn about all of that next step research. So I'll close just by saying thanks to Anne and our panelists, and to all the participants who asked great questions. And to note that we welcome you to join us again in our upcoming webinars in this series. We have next Ruth Dassenville on January 8th, who's going to be talking about the gender gap in voter turnout, and Yotam Margalit on January 22nd on the political consequences of green policies. So thanks to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you then.